For quite a while, The Lord of the Rings was thought of as being unfilmable. And yet, there was one ambitious filmmaker who sought to do the impossible and bring those 3 epic tomes into the realm of film. The proposal was costly and daring, but with an excellent production team, a star-studded cast, and a lot of imagination, it might just have had a chance. It had everything you could possibly want from a fantasy epic: action, monsters, brotherly love, and an extended kabuki theater prologue in which Sauron is dressed as Mick Jagger. That's right, today I am here to talk to you about the 1970s proposed Lord of the Rings script written by John Boorman. While this script never actually made it to film for reasons that we will explore later, it is bizarre, occasionally good, and immensely entertaining, so I am going to share with you the entire story from beginning to end with all of the sordid details in between. You may have heard that in this script, Frodo and Galadriel, get it on, but I really hate to tell you, that might not be the wackiest thing that happens in this. But, as amusing as I find this script, I'm not just here to make fun of it. While it is ridiculous at points, by looking at this script and the way that it relates to and deviates from Tolkien's original book, we can learn a lot about the context that The Lord of the Rings has existed in over time in the public imagination, and some of the blessings and challenges of adaptation as an art. But before we get into that, I do need to talk to you guys about something, and that is your internet safety and this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Private Internet Access is a VPN that's going to protect your information from the prying eyes of hackers, internet service providers, and anyone else that can access your private data. If you connect to the internet or use Wi-Fi at airports, coffee shops, your friends' houses, and even your own house, your data could be at risk of being stolen. But Private Internet Access has got you covered by encrypting your internet connection through their world-class server infrastructure, keeping your info shielded and bulletproof. I love being able to get out of the house and work on scripts at libraries or even on public transportation, but I'm always a little bit iffy about using public Wi-Fi. But with private internet access, I can work comfortably wherever I want, knowing that my information is safe. Private internet access can also allow you to view region-restricted content, including streaming services, by changing your IP address, and you can protect an unlimited number of devices all at the same time. I've been able to meet all of my vampire media needs, like Bram Stoker's Dracula and Let the Right One In, using private internet access. They're available across all platforms, and signing up is completely risk-free thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. I love feeling secure online and being able to access region-locked content, and private internet access is a great way for you to get all of the benefits and none of the hassle. And you can use my link in the description to get an 83% discount. That is just $2.03 a month, plus you get an extra 4 months completely free. Thanks so much to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. The Lord of the Rings was published in 1954, and by the 60s, it had become a bit of a cultural phenomenon. It especially found an audience with college-aged kids, especially those in the hippie countercultural movement, which was in full swing at this time. And as The Lord of the Rings became more and more popular, there were a lot of murmurings about it being adapted into a movie. And this all was happening at a time when the film industry was in a really volatile place. Starting in roughly 1967, we see the New Hollywood movement, which swept in, seeking to get rid of the old Hollywood and replace it with a whole new wave of writers and directors. The old studio system was collapsing, and film was becoming more and more experimental than ever before, with the reins of a production being handed off from the large corporate studio off to individual directorial minds. One of these directorial minds was British filmmaker John Boorman. Although he was a bit older and more established than some of the other directors from the New Hollywood movement, Boorman had made his name on films like Point Blank, and he would go on to write and direct some truly fundamental films. So, when in 1970, United Artists acquired the rights to The Lord of the Rings for $250,000, John Boorman was the man they wanted to create the film. He was given the funds to workshop a script and a budget, and with the help of co-writer Rospo Pallenberg, they got to work on a preliminary script. The script that we have that has been published online and that I'm going to be sharing with you today is their third draft. And although a script tends to change a lot when a movie is actually being made, this is probably the closest thing we can get to truly understanding Boorman's vision for the film. I am going to be linking a PDF of this script in the description if you want to follow along or read it yourself, but I also will be putting up sections of the script, especially when I'm reading aloud, on screen, quite honestly, because I don't think you'll believe me if I don't put them on screen. I feel like you'll think I'm just writing bad fan fiction and sharing it with you in this format, but no. Everything that I am about to read is truly a proposed version of The Lord of the Rings that was given to a studio and seriously considered. We would have entered in a little study crammed with books with a cameo from J.R.R. Tolkien himself. You should note that Boorman was actually in contact with Tolkien, and although he never saw the drafts of the script, which is probably for the best, Tolkien was excited for this film to be made, which is kind of crazy. Anyway, Tolkien would have looked up over his glasses into the camera, and then we would have moved on to the opening credits. The camera would rise up out of the fires of Mount Doom, and we would get this bird's eye view of all of Middle-earth going back from Mount Doom, and a heroic yet melancholic song would have been playing with the sound of the One Ring chant over that. One ring to rule them all, one ring to bind them. Finally, we settle in the Shire, where Bilbo Baggins's 11st birthday is in full swing. And look, this script isn't great, and I'm not going to try and defend it. However, I will say that it is so refreshing to see a vision of Middle-earth that is not at all influenced by Peter Jackson's vision. I love those movies, but he and his team have completely defined what multiple generations of people will think of as what Middle-earth looks like. And so, while I'm reading this script to you, I do want you to set aside what you know Middle-earth looks like in your imagination and really take in this alternate version, because it does have moments where I think it's really neat. We enter a mellow walled and cobbled yard abutting to Bilbo's cottage. It is something between a kitchen garden, a farmyard, and the cloister of a medieval monastery. Arches in the wall let out onto a vegetable patch, an orchard, flower beds, grazing animals. Hanging in the surrounding trees are lanterns and jars of fireflies. It is in Bilbo's enchanting little backyard that the party is taking place, and as Bilbo gets up to make his speech, to thank everyone for coming, to, lead up to making a very important announcement, we get a surprise visitor. With a crash of fireworks, Gandalf the Grey appears, and all the hobbits are incredibly excited to see him. All except Bilbo, who's made rather nervous by his appearance. Bilbo tries to press on with this speech, but Gandalf keeps interrupting him by continuing to throw fireworks in the air, and then when everyone's distracted and Bilbo's looking at Gandalf, he starts mouthing, "The ring!" to him, really obviously. And right off the bat, you kind of get the vibe that this Gandalf is perhaps not as nice and grandfatherly as the Gandalf that we see in The Lord of the Rings. He is conniving, and he is definitely here on a mission. But before Bilbo can try and finish up his speech, music kicks in, and it's played by an instrument that is a mixture of bagpipes and a saxophone, and something else that is something between a fiddle and a ukulele. The hobbits get to dancing, and Bilbo and Gandalf finally get to have a private moment to speak when they find themselves in each other's arms on the dance floor. Bilbo is flushed and happy, but suddenly he sweeps around and finds himself caught in Gandalf's arms, who leads him in a giddy, twisting dance. He looks deep into Bilbo's eyes, and everything else becomes excluded, a confused whirl of color, a blur of trees, lanterns, stars. This is where they have their conversation about the ring and about how Bilbo feels like butter scraped over too much bread, and this is where Bilbo decides to make his exit. Amidst the cauliflowers in the backyard, Bilbo drops the ring into Gandalf's hat and trots off into the wilderness, with just one glance back at his nephew Frodo, who is dancing shyly with a buxom hobbit maiden. The party comes to a close, and we are briefly introduced to our other hobbits. Frodo is bidding goodbye to his young friends, Sam, Merry, and Pippin. Sam has his arm around a pretty hobbit girl whose sleepy head rests on his shoulder. So in this version, Sam has game. He gets the ladies. Good for him. Frodo drifts off on the dining table, but he is woken by the sound of a goose hissing angrily. And you will only understand why the mention of a goose is so exciting if you're deep in the lore on my Discord. But trust me, it is incredibly exciting. Frodo looks up to see that the goose is hissing at a dark figure on horseback in the trees. Frodo heads inside to find Gandalf, who tells him that Bilbo left and hands Frodo the ring. Frodo tries to put it on, but there are unseen forces that prevent him from being able to wear the ring at all, and suddenly he finds himself chanting the One Ring verse. One ring to rule them all, one ring to bind them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. He's never heard it before, he doesn't know where it came from. The ring must have put it in his mind. Frodo tries to give Gandalf the ring back, but he refuses, explaining that the ring can only be carried by someone who is simple and weak. You know, like Frodo. Then Merry, who they specify as a fat hobbit, and Pippin, who they specify as a skinny hobbit, those are their only character traits, so you should probably remember them, as well as Sam, all burst into Bag End and announce that they too, like Frodo, have seen a horseman in the forest. Gandalf doesn't explain, why that's a problem. He kind of just brushes off the danger of it, and then changes the subject and tells Frodo that he should take the hobbits, and the ring, of course, on a little boys' trip to Rivendell to celebrate his new inheritance. They skip out the door on their way to Rivendell, and Gandalf doesn't warn them of any real danger, and he also doesn't go with them. He doesn't have a reason for not going with them. He's not doing anything that we are informed of like he is in the book. He just sends them off into danger alone. Then again, as you will come to learn, this is in character for Boorman's Gandalf. He really loves endangering and upsetting people for his own personal gain, which is awesome. On their walking trip, the hobbits are swept off the road into an apple orchard. A path leads them out of the swirling petals into a field covered with mushrooms. The hobbits are delighted. They set to picking and eating them as fast as they can. They begin to laugh and giggle, becoming rather unsteady on their feet. They lurch on their way with contented smiles on their faces. The world looks a little misty, different. Suddenly, they are in a field of buttercups. Naked children run and play among golden flowers. Now, considering that this was, the early 70s, so basically the 60s, I'm not all too surprised to find a trippy mushroom flower child sequence in this script, but I will point out that I am not sure that's what Tolkien intended when he said mushrooms. But the hobbits head out of the field of naked children, which is also a thing, but whatever. And then they find themselves in a scary field full of spooky scarecrows, which sobers them up considerably. Next, they end up in a field where men are working on their farm, and the men catch a glimpse of the hobbits, and they say that if you catch one, apparently you can get a reward. So apparently, in John Boorman's Middle-earth, men hunt hobbits for sport. Frodo, understandably, doesn't really like that they're talking bad about hobbits, so he jumps out to taunt them, and when they run after him, he does a somersault, and midway through that standing somersault, he slips the ring on and vanishes. That is the first time in this script that Frodo puts on the ring, and it is midway through a somersault. One of the Black Riders, a Nazgul, shows up, and so the hobbits flee into the Old Forest, where immediately they do not like the way that the trees are looking at them. One of them trips over a root, and having heard stories about how the forest is alive, they immediately pull out axes and start threatening the forest around them. Sam goes in especially hard, threatening all of the trees around him with wormwood, but then he's smacked by a tree branch and changes his mind, and then he starts apologizing profusely to the trees and telling them to dig deep and drink water, the lines that Tom Bombadil has in the book, and that Treebeard gets in the movie are given to Sam in this particular scene. The trees decide that after that the hobbits are pretty cool, and they work some kind of magic to put the hobbits to sleep, and once the hobbits wake up, they find that they have been transported to the other side of the Old Forest, presumably by the trees. So that means that we have the Old Forest and the Tom Bombadil sequence and Fangorn Forest and the Ents all collapsed into this one scene, which is a really interesting way to do it. The next day, the hobbits once again find themselves fleeing from the Nazgul, whereupon they encounter a ranger called Strider. Well, I don't think he's technically called Strider in the script at any point, but we all know him as Strider. And initially they're quite suspicious of him, but there's not a whole lot of time to get to know him because suddenly the Nazgul are upon them. The ranger crosses his arms and draws two swords. They are the two broken halves of one sword. One hand brandishes the original handle, while the other grasps a makeshift handle of leather bound around the blade. I honestly do kind of love the idea that Aragorn uses the two broken halves of Anduril to dual wield. Boorman and Pallenberg cited Japanese samurai movies as one of the influences for the script, and it's moments like that that I think, even if it's a little bit cheesy, you really see that inspiration coming through. The Nazgul attack, Frodo puts on the ring to try and escape and then is stabbed in the shoulder, but instead of them getting an elvish rescue, Strider piles all four hobbits onto his horse and just sends the horse off and then carries on foot alone. The hobbits make it to the Bruinen outside of Rivendell, and a giant wave washes down the river, and it turns out that that was hiding a whole troop of elvish soldiers who fight the Nazgul, and then the Nazgul melt into a black goo and just flow down the river. And then, thank God, it's time for a little bit of rest and recovery. Frodo wakes up from his Nazgul poison-induced sleep to find himself laying on a crystal table in the middle of a large room, fully nude with only leaves covering him. Beyond the table, tears rise up, and upon them are elves, who are wailing and swaying in unison. Above the tiers of elves, the walls of crystal curve up, forming a dome over the great hall. The flames of an open fire at one end of the hall reflect upon the ceiling. High above, an elf holding a mirror deflects a beam of sunlight down to an elf who stands by the table, and who, in turn, reflects the beam with his mirror onto Frodo's shoulder. Frodo's arm is becoming transparent. The bone is quite clear beneath the translucent skin. Elrond rises and motions towards a young girl, about 13 years of age. So that girl is Arwen. You may be asking, why is she 13? Either way, she's there with a really long knife, and she's gonna stab it into Frodo's wound for healing reasons. Also, Gimli is there. He's standing by with his axe, and he has been instructed to chop Frodo's arm off if things get messy. As Arwen fishes around in Frodo's wound and the elves chant and wail all around them, we also find out that Boromir is here, and he tries to make a grab for the ring, but he is repelled by unknown magical forces. Arwen fishes the chunk of Nazgul poison out of Frodo's wound, and everyone rejoices, and Frodo fully comes out of his daze, only to realize that the Council of Elrond is actively happening around him. This was like a midpoint, this was a break they took to try and heal Frodo, and so he shuffles off to the side of the table to sit down with everyone else. Presumably still nude. They never say that he got dressed. So either way, the council commences. And this whole healing scene is bizarre. It's definitely odd. However, it is not without historical precedence, because especially in the Victorian period, surgeries would have a whole audience of people watching, and surgeons got a kind of celebrity status. So you know what? There is a kind of justification for this communal surgery experience. However, I don't know if there's a historical precedence for the surgeon being 13 years old, but take that as you will. Now, as we all know, the Council of Elrond has a lot of exposition. You gotta figure out, what the ring is, where it came from, Elrond's relationship with it, what happened with Gandalf and Saruman. And instead of using boring exposition, Boorman instead introduces another device. An elaborate theater performance. While the voices chant, a group of actors in costumes and masks, a motley assortment representing the beings of Middle-earth, mounts onto the table. A small mongrel dog jumps onto the table and runs wildly around, barking. A character who is a combination of Mick Jagger and Punch leaps onto the table. So that guy is Sauron, and he starts juggling a golden ball, which is meant to represent the ring, and he's going around, seducing various people with his ring powers, but he is not actually intended to be the star of the show. The outstanding characteristic of the play is the dog, forever playing and performing with the ball, the ring, and recognizing none of the players as his real master. The dog symbolizes fate, and also the ring's own will. Now, sure, hereabouts I could complain about the fact that, in the book, at least, the concept of fate and the ring's will are two very different things and can't really be represented by one character. However, I think I should instead address the larger problem at hand, which is the entrance of Gandalf and Saruman. The two of them begin closing in on Gollum, who currently has the ring ball, but before they're able to get it, Sauron changes Saruman's mind, and he turns traitor. Saruman throws open his cape and pulls his phony beard over his head. It looks like flowing blonde hair, and he behaves like a femme fatale. Saruman grabs Gandalf, and the two roll around on the table. Boorman describes Saruman trying to sway Gandalf to his side as a seduction, and he has Saruman playing a femme fatale. Which is just a really interesting interpretation of their relationship. Anyway, the council proceeds after the play has ended, Frodo volunteers, and the Fellowship heads out, accompanied by some expositional voiceover from Elrond. We see a great open landscape of trees and hills. Against the sky, walking in line, are 9 figures of differing shapes and sizes. Superimposed across the scene is the face of Elrond, itself a landscape, its beard flowing into the grass, its hair entwining with the trees. I cannot help but imagine this scene as the evil precursor to that already kind of cursed scene in the movies where Elrond's face fades into a whiteout. But Boorman describes the hobbits then cavorting across Elrond's cheek and his nose and stuff. I would kill to see this scene because I have no idea what that would look like, and maybe it would be good. I don't know, I shouldn't judge. Gandalf and Elrond have a little psychic chat about Frodo, and Gandalf ends with this line that, to their credit, I think is pretty well written. The play is written. We may prompt the players, Elrond, you and I, nothing more. We get to see flashbacks of Arwen giving the Fellowship their magical cloaks, as well as her giving them lembas bread, which in this version of the story changes taste to whatever you're thinking about when you're eating it. Merry and Pippin are playing with this, thinking about leek soup and honey cakes and cherry pie, and Gandalf sees that they're having a good time and decides that that's not an option. So he walks up behind them, and just as they're taking a bite, he whispers cod liver oil in their ears, and of course then it tastes like cod liver oil and they start gagging. He warns them that magic is always both good and bad, but I can't help but just see that as bullying. It's so mean-spirited. Later on in the journey, Frodo wakes up in the middle of the night to see Boromir and Aragorn arguing over the fire. They're arguing about the typical stuff, you know, how Arwen is the reluctant heir to the throne of Gondor and how Boromir's not super happy about that. But Boromir escalates, grabbing one half of Anduril from Aragorn's scabbard and challenging him to a fight. But before they're able to get at it, Arwen magically appears between them. She tells them to calm down, and in a story that is oddly similar to the biblical story of splitting a baby in half, she tells them that they should each carry one half of Anduril. Boromir and Aragorn bend the two sword halves to her. She kisses each blade on their keen edges. She looks up, and there is blood on her lips. She goes first to Aragorn and kisses his mouth, then to Boromir and kisses him. Her blood is on their blades and on their mouths. Aragorn and Boromir, I bind you in brotherhood with my blood, she says. The two men bend their knees and kiss the thighs of her dress. They are both deeply moved. Boromir weeps openly, and a tear starts out of Aragorn's gray eyes. They rise up, and Boromir kisses Aragorn's mouth. They turn back to Arwen, but she is gone. Frodo watches in awe. I don't know if you guys heard that, but as soon as I started reading that passage, sirens started going off, which is appropriate because, mind you, she's 13. She's 13 and she's kissing these grown men, and they're kissing her thighs and then they're kissing each other, which is fine and seems consensual, but still, she's 13. But even without that specific freakiness, it's still a weird scene. Where did she come from? Where did she go? Which one of them gets the half of Anduril that actually has a handle? That feels like really important information. Either way, they're cool with each other, and now that they've kissed, they're not gonna fight anymore. Which, I guess that's how that works. They make their way up into the Misty Mountains, where they're faced by wargs that are trying to kill them. Fortunately, Gandalf has a plan. Is it a good plan? No. Is it a plan? Kind of. He starts up a big roaring fire, which begins melting the snow underneath it, and that turns into a river of water that immediately starts freezing. Gandalf thrusts a flask into Sam's mouth, rips it away, and thrusts it into Pippin's. The hobbits pass around the flask, gulping down draughts. Immediately, they become tipsy and giggly. Now Gandalf brutally grabs the hobbits and lays them on the ice where the water is gushing away from under the fire and refreezing. Gandalf jumps to Frodo's side. He rotates his fingers on Frodo's eyeballs, then he jumps to Merry's side. Frodo's eyeballs continue to rotate. The rhythm of his breath slows down. Trusting the fire to hold off the wargs for a bit, Gandalf hypnotizes the members of the Fellowship one by one, until finally he hypnotizes himself and lays down. The blaze of the fire subsides. Water gushes over the nine, freezing around them and over them. Gandalf's face is the last to be covered. The tip of his long nose disappears beneath the rising surface of the water. A warg leaps at it viciously. Its jaws smash against the ice. I get it. I really do. They wanted Gandalf to be a bit more of a Merlin character. They wanted him to do more magic in the story. But this particular thing it's so convoluted. It feels like something that I would have come up with when I was like 9 years old and I was daydreaming fan fiction on long car rides. They introduced this conflict just to solve it in a way that kind of it doesn't even make sense. And I don't get why this scene was put in here. Especially because it has no impact on the plot from here. The Fellowship, frozen into a glacier, break off and float down the river, and then they get somewhere a little warmer, they melt, and then they keep on keeping on up into the Misty Mountains. They make it all the way to the doors of Moria, but it turns out that the doors can only be opened by a secret dwarf password, and Gimli would know it, but he's lost his secret dwarf knowledge. So Gandalf, once again, hatches a plan. He begins verbally and physically abusing Gimli, calling him a greedy hole-digging dwarf who dug too deep and woke evil things from the ground, and Gimli is immediately triggered and goes full-on mole mode. Gimli begins cutting into the ground with his axe and chopping through rocks. Working with an animal fury, he digs away, scooping out the earth. He burrows into the ground like a mole. Gandalf swirls off his cloak and casts it onto Gimli, covering him. With his staff, he thrashes at the shape beneath the cloak. Under the darkness of the cloak, Gimli is frantically attempting to escape as he relives the ancestral memory Gandalf is recalling. Through verbal and physical abuse, Gandalf unlocks Gimli's secret, dwarven ancestral memories, and they make it inside. And you know what? Gimli thanks him for this abuse. And I don't get why scenes like this happen, because it makes less sense. And Tolkien had this scene in the book. It had a nice riddle, it was a well-structured scene that is not hard to translate onto film, so I don't understand why we benefit from triggering Gimli into a fugue state by having Gandalf beat him repeatedly with a stick. Speaking of unnecessary changes, they make it into Moria, where they find it full of orcs. However, in this world, orcs are bird-like, and they have armor growing spontaneously from their bodies. And not just that, they are lying dormant in a kind of hibernation state all across the floor. And they can only be awakened from this hibernation state by someone stepping on or kicking them. So Boromir accidentally steps on one, and it wakes up, and then it starts hitting all of the other orcs around them to wake them up. Why are they written like this? I don't know. Does it contribute to the plot in any meaningful way? No. Is it kind of cool? Debatable. From there, we have the Balrog scene, which is pretty unembellished. Gandalf fights the Balrog, he falls, and they all escape. They're all heartbroken over the loss of Gandalf, even though he was kind of mean and terrible to them all the time. But still, they're sad, and they find their way into an enchanted lake. They jump into the lake and find out that it has magical healing properties, but their bath is interrupted by the emergence from the water of a tall, beautiful, and, as it should be noted, sparsely clad woman. It's Galadriel, and she is so smoking hot and scantily clad that nobody can even think. They're all like awooga, and their eyes are turning into hearts and all of those other cartoonish things. And this scene that's about to come up is insane. And I am gonna read it directly from the script, just so you don't think I'm making it up. Just Aragorn and Legolas endure her glance, while Boromir is confused, looking away and then glancing back again, seductively. She says, "Not since the broader days when I was queen in my own land have I seen elf, man, dwarf, and halfling together." Pippin says, "We're hobbits, not halflings." She casts a cold look at Pippin, who cringes. Shimmering pearls of water glide down her body. Legolas says, "Oh, Galadriel, you are Galadriel of the Mirror." Legolas strums on his bow, breaks into a bird-like dance, and then says in a suave, seductive voice, "Your beauty plucks at my heart as a bird seeks out the fruit among the leaves." Was that suave and seductive? I don't know. Anyway, while Legolas performs, Gimli's eyes drift across Galadriel's body. He tosses and catches his axe, looking tough. Boromir is puffing himself and throws back his cloak to reveal his muscles, while Aragorn takes up a stance of dignified nobility. Unfortunately, then somebody brings up Gandalf, who's like dead and stuff, and that kind of kills the mood, and the hobbits start singing this dirge about his fireworks and how great he was. But the mood has not been killed for Boromir, who decides now is the time to shoot his shot. Boromir says, "You are the true mirror of beauty, Lady of the Mirror. I am Boromir, and my father Denethor is the steward of the great city of Minas Tirith, which alone stands in arms against the common enemy." Boromir, with a flush of passion, takes her in his arms and kisses her. She remains aloof and unresponsive. His ardor withers, and he turns away with a bitter cry of humiliation. What is a bitter cry of humiliation? Is that like, ah! Ah! Maybe that was it. Maybe that was the bitter cry of humiliation. That I'm certainly feeling humiliated. Of course, none of these overt seduction attempts work on Galadriel, and she instead chooses the ever-shy Frodo Baggins to be the one who, you know, looks in her mirror, if you know what I'm saying. So yeah, in the next scene they're looking into her mirror, but that doesn't last long, and then they kiss, and then we very elegantly cut away from the two of them and whatever they may be doing to see the Fellowship, who are sitting in a tent nearby thinking about Galadriel. Gimli calls Galadriel a, quote, "mighty piece of stone for a dwarvish tool to carve," and Merry takes a bite of the lembas. He savors it ecstatically, and then he announces that when he ate that lembas, he was thinking about Galadriel. Which, if you'll remember, whatever you're thinking about when you eat the lembas is what it tastes like. They sort of discuss actual business, but for the most part they're just preoccupied with whatever it is that Frodo's getting into. Unwittingly, Gimli runs his finger along the gleaming edge of his axe. He reacts with an aggrieved howl. Legolas, who is dozing off, smiles. The others fidget and turn as they seek elusive sleep. Gimli's howl turns into a sensual cry, and now sounds more like Frodo's voice. We return to Frodo and Galadriel to find them floating on their backs in the pool in post-coital bliss, and it is here where they have the conversation about the ring, where Frodo offers it to her and she denies it. And this is also where Frodo finds his courage, as Galadriel seems to shrink and diminish at the sight of the ring. Frodo seems to grow and seems to become more powerful, and the script calls him ascendant now and greater than she. The Fellowship comes out announcing that it's time for them to leave, but Frodo has found his courage and he's gonna stand up to them. They look angrily at Frodo, but he faces them calmly and squarely, standing a little in front of Galadriel. They notice his new assurance, and their determined, aggressive manner melts into uncertainty. So there's a lot that can be said about this scene. Obviously, it is a deviation from canon, and it's not something that Tolkien ever would have written into this world. But even beyond just that, I kind of hate the implications of this scene. Throughout the story, Frodo will continue referring back to this experience as, like, the turning point for him. It's when he found his courage. Galadriel doesn't give him a phial of light to carry with him and light his way. Instead, this sexual experience with Galadriel is that guiding light. And I don't know if I like the premise that having sex with a beautiful woman will somehow make you more manly and allow you to man up and finish the job. It feels very dated. It also implies that Frodo becomes strong as he sees that Galadriel becomes weak and needs protecting, which is odd because she is thousands of years older than him and is and continues to be far more powerful than he ever was. So the idea that Frodo needs to protect Galadriel is kind of insane in canon. And honestly, I don't know why I'm earnestly analyzing this scene, because it's insane, but I just want to point out that I don't like this scene, not just because Frodo's getting laid, but because I think that there are deeper problems at play. So it's multi-dimensional. I swear I've thought about this. They leave Galadriel's House of Pleasure on a makeshift raft, and they head down the Anduin, but then they're attacked by orcs. They're all shot by arrows at one point or another, and they're forced to navigate a whitewater rapids, but they all miraculously survive, and they're fine after that. And then, of course, it is time for the intermission. So go ahead. Go get some more popcorn or a drink or something. Concessions are kind of how movie theaters survive. So how are we all feeling? We're not feeling good? No? Okay, yeah, me neither. But the show's back on, so let's get back to it. They have a talk about whether they're going to be heading north directly to Mordor, or if they're going to go south to Gondor, and they put the decision up to Frodo, who has to walk off to think for a while. Boromir follows him, and then everything roughly plays out like it does at the end of the Fellowship and the beginning of the Two Towers. They are attacked by orcs. Merry and Pippin are taken by the orcs. Boromir is killed. Aragorn sees Boromir before he dies and promises to go after Gondor, and Frodo and Sam make off to Mordor alone. A lot happens there, but I figure that if you're here, you've seen the movies, so you know what's going on. Then, instead of going directly to Gondor, Aragorn decides that first they are going to go and rescue Merry and Pippin. They encounter the Rohirrim and Éomer, who in this story is Theoden's son, and as a threat, Legolas twangs his bow menacingly. And I'm not an expert on archery, but I don't see that as being a very menacing act, but who knows? I wasn't there. But they realize that Merry and Pippin probably aren't dead, and so they leave them, completely abandon them, and go off to gather armies to protect Gondor. Did I mention that they completely skip over the Battle of Helm's Deep? Because they completely skip over the Battle of Helm's Deep. Frodo and Sam find themselves in the marshes, and it is there that they meet Gollum for the first time. He's covered head to toe in mud, and he's chewing on worms, and they don't, trust him. However, they find out that he's a hobbit, and Frodo wants to have mercy on him, and so they decide to let him be their guide. In the night, when Frodo and Sam are asleep and Gollum is awake, he sees them sinking into the mud of the swamp, and he has this long conversation, this debate with himself about whether or not he's going to rescue them. Eventually, he does decide to rescue them, but in doing so, he himself is plunged into the mud, he falls backwards, and he drowns while saving them. So that's Gollum dealt with. Introduced and gone within, 10 or 15 pages. It's quite concise. This is intercut with Merry and Pippin, who have escaped the orcs, and they are walking through Fangorn Forest. It is there that they meet a man dressed all in white, who turns out to be Gandalf. After a brief internal battle, in which the hobbits have to play act Gandalf's death in order to remind him of who he is while he tries to battle off Saruman, Gandalf is immensely glad to see Merry and Pippin. "Ah, hobbits," Gandalf says. "All wizards should have a hobbit or two in their care." Pippin says, "Gandalf, who talks and lives in riddles." Merry spits on his fingers and twirls one of Gandalf's bushy eyebrows. "That's the Gandalf I remember." Look, I have never spat on my fingers and twirled my friend's eyebrows, but I don't think that my experiences have been universal, and maybe I just don't have the right kind of friends. Gandalf takes over the mind of a hawk and uses him to get a bird's eye view of everything that's happening in Middle-earth, and through that we get a summary of what's happening in the movie thus far, which is quite convenient. And then Merry and Pippin and Gandalf hop onto Shadowfax and head off for Rohan. By this point, you may have clued into the fact that we are absolutely speed-running the second and effectively third books, and while I am moving along a little faster in my description, the script also just does jump into absolute hyperdrive the second that we're done with Fellowship. And I find that this is something that gets done in a lot of adaptations that try and turn the 3 books of The Lord of the Rings into one individual story. A lot of the TV and film adaptations have done it. Oftentimes, honestly, a lot of them will do a part 1 that is Fellowship, and sometimes the part 2 that would be Two Towers and Return of the King never gets made at all. Even the Lord of the Rings musical, which is pretty well done, also does this. And you know what? John Boorman may very well have been one of the pioneers in that attitude, because the second two books are completely and utterly destroyed in this script. In Rohan, there are, as you should expect, sexy women doing sexy dances in silk in front of the corrupted King Theoden, but Gandalf tears down the silk banners from the hall, and he uses the silk banner to do such a cool dance while he talks about death that Theoden's mind is shaken free from the corruption, and he's saved, and everyone claps, and even Éowyn, who's sitting there, is like, wow, that was so compelling that I think I want to go to war. So then they do go to war. Theoden musters the Rohirrim, he gets word to Éomer, and they all head off to Gondor, because I guess that's what happens when you don't have the Battle of Helm's Deep. Things move a lot faster. Merry is left with the people of Rohan, and Pippin and Gandalf ride off to Gondor faster than everybody else as a bit of an advance team. Meanwhile, Frodo and Sam make it to the wall, to the gate of Mordor, and they're freaking out because they're like, how are we gonna get through? But then they see a very conveniently placed tree that is growing out of the side of the wall. So they go up to the tree, that's where they fall asleep, and then bam! In the middle of the night, the tree burrows its way through the wall, and now they are in Mordor. Problem solved. We then get a peek into Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli gathering their respective armies. Aragorn, followed by the Rangers of the North, rides through an ancient battlefield. Aragorn is standing in his saddle, arms raised in salute. He calls out a deep, wordless cry. In response, the dead, men and elves, rise up, ripping open their graves. They stagger to their feet. The living corpses limp behind the horsemen. Legolas runs from branch to branch through a dark forest, calling out. He climbs into the higher branches and emerges above the foliage. Over the verdant expanse of leaves, other tree elves appear, responding to Legolas's summons. Gimli gallops up to the opening of a great pit and rides around the brink, calling out in his ancient tongue. From the bottom of the pit, emerging out of the burrowings, squinting like moles, dwarves look up and cheer. They toss their axes and clamber up. There's so much to take in there. It implies that Aragorn's army is actual zombies, that elves live in trees, and of course that dwarves are basically just moles living in the ground and burrowing through it like worms. Frodo and Sam are fleeing some orcs, and they jump into a canal. The canal sweeps them down into the lair of Shelob. But Frodo, who is still coming off the high of sleeping with the world's most eligible elf bachelorette, he decides to step up to the plate. He says, "I shall slay it, Sam. I am the Lord of the Ring. For you, Galadriel." He is then immediately stabbed and incapacitated by Shelob, and it's up to Sam to kill Shelob and save the day. Gandalf and Pippin arrive in Minas Tirith to find it actively collapsing under the attack and the mad influence of its ruler, the steward Denethor. Denethor only lets them in because he wants word of what happened to his beloved son Boromir, his only son because Faramir doesn't exist in this version. But before he can hear what happened, he's gonna put Pippin through some just grade A hazing rituals. Denethor and Pippin stroll along the top of the wall in a leisurely promenade. Pippin is dressed as a court jester, with cap and bells. The clothes do not fit too well, and are blood-stained and full of arrow holes, suggesting the fate of his predecessor. Denethor asks Pippin all kinds of questions, all of which seem to be leading up to the most important question. Was Boromir able to seduce Galadriel? Denethor is very disappointed by the answer. Before Gondor can be overtaken by orcish armies, the riders of Rohan arrive, and they charge into battle. Theoden comes to face the great Nazgul lord, and he is immediately speared through with a lance. It comes in one side and is sticking out the other. However, he's not going down yet, so he uses the back of the lance, which is sticking out of him, to cut down the knees of the Nazgul's horse. And I can't tell if that's really stupid or really cool, but I do like it. Eowyn, who is disguised as a rider, swoops in with Merry, and together they kill the Nazgul, and it's only after she's fallen that they realize who she is, and that she's a woman. So there's no big reveal moment, but she does save Theoden. Denethor, Gandalf, and Pippin come down from Gondor to see what's going on, and Denethor, being the absolute drama queen that he is, lays down next to Theoden, who is actively dying, and pretends to be dying. He's convulsing, he's going, I'm dying, even though he's not dying at all. It's really weird, but with his dying breath, Theoden gives his crown to his son, Éomer. But before they're able to celebrate too much, something else shows up. A clamor of horrified cries rises from the walls. Far to the right, winding across a hillock and approaching Minas Tirith, is a monstrous snake, perhaps 100 yards long. Children scream and the elders fall onto their knees in despair. However, that despair is misled, because that snake breaks up, and it's revealed that this is actually Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli's armies, who are carrying shields that are painted like snake scales, and they're running very fast, I suppose. This, I would say, rivals the whole being frozen into a glacier thing for, like, convoluted battle tactics that I would have thought up when I was 9 years old. However, it does advance the plot, so I'll take it. I forgot to mention that, meanwhile, Frodo and Sam... Frodo has been taken by orcs. Sam took the ring off of him, and then Frodo was taken by orcs. And Frodo is being tortured. They've put a special Nazgul helmet on his head, and it has, like, screws coming out of it into his face. And it's really painful. And Sam is watching, and he's like, I'm gonna have to do something, but for now I've got the ring, and that's pretty cool. Okay. Back to the battle sequence. They fight off the orcs, and there is a frankly awesome moment that rivals any of the cool moments that Peter Jackson ever put in the Lord of the Rings movies, in which an orc shows up, a giant orc, and then it gets cut in half from head to toe, and the sides split apart to reveal Gimli standing there. And that rules. But then the battle is over, and Aragorn finds Merry and heals him with his magical king hands, and then he sees Denethor, who is still deeply in his madness. Aragorn goes up to embrace him. Denethor has a dagger in his hand. Unseen by all, he points his dagger at his own heart. Aragorn embraces him, and in doing so, his chest pushes the dagger into Denethor's breast. Aragorn rises and quickly pulls out the blade, but it is too late. Okay, so now Denethor and Theoden are dead. Sure. But then Aragorn sets eyes on his future wife, Éowyn, for the very first time. Aragorn summons all his strength and grasps Éowyn's body tightly to his. The onlookers are deadly silent. Éowyn does not stir. Aragorn spreads out her arms and covers her with his body. He presses his palms on her palms, his legs on her. After a moment, she moans, and her body writhes, trapped under Aragorn's great weight. When he feels her stir, he rises, lifting her with him, enfolding her in his arms, pressing her mouth and body to his. Gandalf folds the banner as if performing a ritual. Aragorn releases her mouth, and she sucks in a breath, gasping. He looks into her face, enraptured by her pale beauty. Aragorn whispers to her in a low voice, "My breath I give to you, Lady Éowyn. My life I give you. By the ache of exile I draw out your ache. By the long nights I have lain alone, I call you back to me." She stirs. Her eyes flutter open for a second, but she fades again. Aragorn grasps her and kisses her with passion and intensity. Gandalf dips the banner, now tightly folded, into the blood of Denethor. The blood soaks into the white cloth. Éowyn floats out of her deep coma and looks into Aragorn's sad, loving eyes. Her face flushes with color as the grayness fades. She smiles. They look into each other's eyes with love. Alright, the optics on that one are not great. She is waking up from being dead to find a strange man who she has never met before kissing her. However, the alternative is a 13-year-old girl. So I don't know what's worse. Also, yeah, while all of that's happening, Gandalf is folding up a flag of Gondor and doing a fun little tie-dye craft project with the flag and Denethor's blood. And then he unfurls it, and it looks really cool. And they all look at it and go, that's really cool. And then Aragorn magically joins together the two halves of Andúril, and now he has a sword, and he's the king, and Éowyn is the queen. Trying to explain this script to someone feels like trying to explain a dream that I had one time, and I feel like I'm losing my mind. From there, everybody in the Gondor gang takes a shower and gets a new set of clothes, including Éowyn. By Aragorn's side is his queen Éowyn, her golden hair flowing, silver armor following the contours of her body and breasts. You could have just said body. You could have just said body and we would have gotten the point, but no, you needed to emphasize. Okay. Anyway, they're headed off to the gates of Mordor to challenge Sauron to a fight, and of course, they bring along their brass band to keep up the spirits with some music. Cutting back to Frodo and Sam, there's a lot of fighting that's happening that I don't want to explain, and so I'm not going to. Basically, Sam is using the power of the ring to magically repulse the other orcs. At one point, he swings the ring around his head on a chain to create a force field. And there's a lot of, like, dramatic slipping and falling of Sam and Frodo. There's this one time when Sam falls onto a stalagmite, and they think that it's just fully, like, you punctured him all the way through and that he's dead. But then he rolls off to reveal that the top of the stalagmite is flat and wasn't stabbing him, and it was a trick that he pulled. How is it flat? Why is it flat? How did this happen? I don't know, and you have got to stop asking me these questions. They start scaling Mount Doom, whilst making a special note that Frodo is entirely shirtless, because, yeah, of course that's something that they'd note. They do get a little bit of, if I can't carry it for you, I can carry you, which is always great, but then Gollum pops in. He's not actually dead, and we get to hear Frodo say this to him. Don't touch it, you Gollum. I am Frodo, Lord of the Ring. I know that in another timeline, in another alternate universe, this movie was made, and that line exists in the Lord of the Rings movie. The destruction of the ring carries on without trouble. I mean, there is trouble. Frodo doesn't want to throw the ring away, and then Gollum jumps on him and bites off his finger, and then Gollum falls in, and then they're all good. And the day is saved, and the ring is destroyed. Yay! Oh, also, during all of this, Aragorn is chatting with the mouth of Sauron, who turns out to be Saruman, and Wormtongue is there, and Saruman has a pet cobra with him, but then negotiations fall short, and they're fighting a bunch of orcs and hoping that Frodo destroys the ring so that they don't all get killed. So, then the ring is destroyed, and Frodo and Sam run down the side of Mount Doom into their friends' arms, because apparently they're close enough to do that. Things have had to be geologically compressed for this to work out, but sure. They had giant snake budget and didn't have giant eagle budget. I get it. They're all so excited to see Frodo that they pick him up and they're handing him around, everyone hoisting him in the air, and Gandalf is overcome with emotion, stating the legendary line, "You did it, you hobbit." They all head back to Gondor to celebrate, but not before Gimli gets the chance to show off his stone carving prowess. They walk through the gates of Mordor. The cheers and triumphant music continues. Gimli looks disparagingly at the terrible, grimacing jaws of stone of which the gates are made. With a master stroke, he strikes one corner of the mouth, transforming half of the face into a smile. Now the gates are like the Greek mask of comic tragedy. Many stop to admire and discuss Gimli's work, but he slings his axe across his shoulder and walks off, leaving them to it. The crowd argues about the enigmatic stone face, forgetting Frodo. Back in Gondor, Aragorn and Éowyn are immediately pulled away to start doing, law things, and Pippin and Merry stay with them to be their little, manservants. And so Frodo, Sam, Gandalf, Legolas, and Gimli all start on the journey back to the Shire. On their way out, they see Saruman, who is now a destitute beggar man on the streets, but they ignore him, and then when they get to the Shire, Frodo and Sam get to say goodbye. Sort of. They have come to the road that leads down to the Shire. Frodo says, "I can't, dear Sam. I have been pierced by blade, sting, and tooth. I can't." Sam covers his ears. He will not listen. He turns to hide his face, distraught. Gandalf ruffles Sam's hair affectionately. Sam walks away, down the road by the waterfall toward the valley of the beloved Shire. From below, a crowd of hobbits with banners of welcome come up to meet him. Sam's buxom girlfriend runs ahead and embraces him. And you know what? Good for him. The remaining party members make their way to the shore where there is a boat waiting, and Gandalf and Frodo wade off to the boat where Elrond, Bilbo, and Galadriel are waiting for them to sail across to Valinor. It would seem that Frodo's time in Valinor is gonna be pretty busy after all. Legolas and Gimli stand on the shore and watch them sail off into the sunset. And that, ladies, gentlemen, and other folks, is the end. I feel like I have lived 1,000 lifetimes trying to explain the plot of that script, and I kind of wish that I had something a little stronger in this mug, but I don't. And I think that the worst part of this all is that I can see it in my mind's eye so clearly. I can't help but picture the scenery, the wacky action sequences, the salacious romantic scenes, and, of course, the cast that should have been. According to Boorman and Pallenberg's notes, they were actually in talks to have Ringo Starr of Beatles fame star in this film as Frodo Baggins. Sean Connery was their prime candidate for Aragorn, and they were considering powerhouses like Jack Nicholson, Daniel Day-Lewis, or Jeremy Irons as Gandalf. Apparently, Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin had his agent write in to John Boorman specifically requesting that he plays Elrond. However, they were already considering having all of the elves actually be played by female actors for a more androgynous look, in which case they wanted Elrond to be played by Tilda Swinton. And I think that my favorite tidbit, fun fact about the casting for this movie is that for the role of Gollum, they were considering either Danny DeVito or Jeff Goldblum. I am so conflicted by that information because I love Andy Serkis as Gollum, but I would pay good money to see Danny DeVito as Gollum. That would be amazing. And if Jeff Goldblum was playing Gollum, I would have to contend with the fact that in some way I was attracted to Gollum. And I'm not equipped to deal with that. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you ask, it was never meant to be. Just based on this script, for those large crowd scenes and battles, they would have needed over 66,000 men and 8,000 horses in order for those sequences to work, and the estimated low-end budget was still over $4.5 million. Adjusted for inflation today, that's about $40 million, which, if you compare it to other modern movies, isn't that expensive in the film world, but movies have just gotten more and more expensive to make, so today it would just be out of the water. Either way, this film was way too wild and expensive, especially for United Artists, which was already having financial troubles in the early 70s. And by the mid-1970s, it was clear that this movie was never going to really be made. Boorman continued shopping the script around to other producers and other studios well into the 90s, but it was just never meant to be. Now, in 1981, Boorman was able to direct Excalibur, which is a high fantasy film following the story of Arthur Pendragon, and they actually utilized some of the ideas and a lot of the design concepts from The Lord of the Rings in Excalibur. And honestly, I think that Excalibur ended up being a much better film than his Lord of the Rings ever would have been able to be. You can almost feel in the John Boorman Lord of the Rings script his pull towards Arthuriana and the way he wanted to incorporate elements of the Arthurian myth into the Lord of the Rings. We have the lady in the lake, the magical sword, the fickle, sometimes cruel Merlin-esque wizard. But the problem is that Tolkien fairly explicitly did not base the Lord of the Rings off of Arthurian myth. I did a whole video about it that if you want to watch, you can watch that, but the gist of it is that he didn't love the Arthurian myths and how French they were, and how crazy and confused they were, and so the Lord of the Rings was kind of explicitly not inspired by Arthurian myths. And it's misconceptions like that that are the root problem of the John Boorman Lord of the Rings. But I think now it's time for a post-mortem on this script. It's time to figure out what happened. And I want to begin by laying out the fact that John Boorman, as a writer and as a director, is not incompetent. He went on to create groundbreaking films like Deliverance and a whole bunch more, and he did not go into The Lord of the Rings stupidly or without thinking about it at all. Boorman called the process of adapting The Lord of the Rings into the script radical adaptation, and that has kind of two meanings. First off, in order to adapt the story of The Lord of the Rings into one movie, even one incredibly long movie, a lot of things had to change. Sure, the second act of the movie does get kind of soupy, but there are a lot of adaptational cuts and adjustments and changes that were honestly pretty well done. Plus, there are cuts that he made, like cutting out Tom Bombadil or the Scouring of the Shire, that are changes that filmmakers would continue to make throughout the years. Everyone cuts out Tom Bombadil, everyone cuts out the Scouring of the Shire. It is a well-established thing, and generally accepted as one of the better cuts that you can make in that story. But on top of that, it was called radical adaptation because they wanted to incorporate the radical socio-political ideas that had woven themselves into the culture that had grown up around The Lord of the Rings. While today The Lord of the Rings is regarded as a fairly serious fantasy epic, as this literary endeavor, that was not always the cultural consideration of it. The story was trippy. It engaged with the pseudo-medieval revival that was really kicking in the 60s, and the inclusion of pagan imagery and ideas really meshed well with the countercultural movement. Things like the shortcut to mushrooms or the bizarre kabuki theater scene would not have seemed as out of place and antithetical to The Lord of the Rings as it does now, at least to the majority of the audience that was taking it in at that time. As for the inclusion of overt and constant sexualization of characters, that was certainly more of a leap. Tolkien himself was a conservative Catholic born in the Victorian era. His books are honestly notoriously sexless. There is romance, but it's very chaste and non-physical, and he certainly didn't go about describing every woman that they meet as either scantily clad or buxom. And it seems, based on the notes that we have, that a lot of the drive to up the horniness of The Lord of the Rings actually comes from Boorman's co-writer Rospo Pallenberg, who decided that he didn't want to go about necessarily adapting The Lord of the Rings only, but also the source material that The Lord of the Rings had sprung from. The poems of medieval chivalry and early modern fantasy are generally more infused with sexuality than Tolkien's works, and the idea of sex and romance as a hero's motivation is fairly well grounded in literature. And that is a fair explanation, but honestly, I think a lot of it can just be chalked up to the state of fantasy media at the time. It was not unusual for the only female characters in a story to be very objectified and over-sexualized, and it's unsurprising, if not a little bit disappointing, that this became such a prominent thread in the John Boorman script. Then again, that sexuality did fit in very well with the sexual revolution of the 1960s and the countercultural movements that The Lord of the Rings was associated with. It's all just a reminder that this story was not written in the same cultural context that The Lord of the Rings is in today. Nowadays, fans seem to see Tolkien's works as some kind of sacred, untouchable bastion of pure fantasy, but that's just not always how it was thought of, and before that became the predominant view, people were much more willing to be playful and flexible with the story. They wanted to use its enjoyable imagery, its familiar structure, its wonderful characters to create new stories. In his article exploring the creation of the John Boorman script, Jay Fenwick explains, "The story of The Lord of the Rings, as Pallenberg was recounting it to Boorman at this early stage, was less fantastical, folkloric tale reminiscent of an imagined past for England, and more an allegory of the chaotic, drug-induced, violent decade of the 1960s, and the swaggering danger of bands like the Rolling Stones." Look, I'm not gonna try and be really crazy and get a good thumbnail and claim that this version of The Lord of the Rings should have been made. I think that if it had existed, it would have colored a lot of people's perception of The Lord of the Rings for the worst. But reflecting on this adaptation does get me thinking a bit about the Peter Jackson adaptation of these stories. As much as Peter Jackson's movies do get some flack, especially when you compare it to other adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, you can see that there was a lot of respect for the source material that they had going into it. They didn't want to go for radical adaptation, and instead they went to quite strenuous efforts to stick to the source material and its intent and a lot of its themes. I'm just saying that, people got up in arms about Liv Tyler being cast as Arwen because she was the daughter of Steven Tyler and it was like a nepotism pick instead of being based off of talent. I would love to see how those people responded to Ringo Starr as Frodo. And for those folks that really despise the Rings of Power because they made Galadriel into, a girl boss and a warrior and they totally mischaracterized her, I would kill to see how they reacted to Galadriel's House of Pleasures. But the Boorman script doesn't just make other adaptations look better by comparison. It does go to show just how amazingly flexible the art of storytelling can be. Boorman and Pallenberg had an interpretation of The Lord of the Rings that was just completely at odds with the way that most of us today would interpret the story. And yet, they did interpret it that way. They were able to use the plot beats, the themes, the characters to create a completely different story. And in its own amusing, bizarre, and fascinating way, I do find that truly beautiful. This script has haunted me for years. 3 years, actually, because we are just about coming up on the 3-year anniversary of this channel. So I've been thinking about it for that long, and now you get to as well. You're welcome. As a little treat to myself, I will not be putting out a new video next week, or taking a break week, but after that I will be back to curse you with more unforgettable knowledge. In the comments, let me know what your favorite or least favorite part of this script was, or maybe just the craziest thing. Let me know what you thought the craziest thing was in the comments, because I have no idea how to choose one. It's a fever dream. If you do want to keep yourself safe online, be sure to check out this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access. The link is right down there in the description. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, or if it cursed you with unforgettable information, and consider subscribing if you want to stick around for more videos. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and for some of you, for the last 3 years. And I hope that you have a very happy Hobbity day.